Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. Hammer all my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. We're filming this segment in Toronto with Professor Sabah Alnasseri, who edited Arab Revolutions and Beyond. He's a professor at York University teaching Middle East politics and is a native of Basra, Iraq. We're going to do this in two segments. The first one will be focused on the rise of the Islamic State known as ISIS, and the second will be on the Arab Spring and Arab revolutions, putting them in a historical context and trying to grasp what's going to be or what's going to come next within the Middle East. Thank you, Professor Alnasseri.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
So let's begin with ISIS, which is historically an extremely important movement within the Middle East. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is named for the French and British diplomats that carved up the Middle East among the colonial, among the empire, turning, essentially turning countries in the Middle East into protectorates, has only been changed twice. For the first time was the Israeli independence movement, which rose up in Palestine, and now with ISIS, which controls an area roughly the size of Texas. The mechanisms that were used to redraw the map in the Middle East are the same. The use of foreign money, the use of foreign fighters, the tactics of ethnic cleansing and terrorism, and this mythical vision. In the case of Israel, the recreation of Judea and Samaria from the Bible, the land of Israel, and in the case of ISIS, the recreation of the 7th century caliphate. And these tactics have proved quite effective. In both cases, in the case of Israel and in the case of ISIS, you could argue, especially with ISIS has roughly 20,000 foreign fighters, that these are forces that are as dependent on the areas outside the Middle East as within the Middle East. And I wondered if you could kind of address that phenomena, this phenomena that we're watching.
Right. I mean, you are right, because ISIS has a kind of subtler colonialist form.
Yes.
The way they occupy space, cleanse this space, plunder the resources.
Which is what as Israel does.
Exactly, and carve out territory for itself. But to understand the phenomena of ISIS, we need to contextualize it within the setbacks and counter-revolution against the Arab revolutions.
Right.
The amount of violence, of intervention in Libya, for instance, the war in Libya, the civil war in Syria, now the war also in Yemen.
And Egypt, we can't forget Egypt.
Exactly, we don't forget Egypt. And the failure of these peaceful, non-violent revolutions, this amount of violence, of counter-revolutionary violence, created this Frankenstein, this phenomena. So you can say ISIS is a Hegelian fish synthesis of two forms of violence. Now, what is so interesting about ISIS and why it is so attractive for many young, unemployed, mostly Arab fighters, most of the fighters, by the way, they come from Libya or Tunisia and so on, less from Europe, etc. It's mostly from the Middle East. What attracted them to ISIS is that when this peaceful revolution failed, revolutions turned into kind of jihadism.
Yes.
That ISIS is much more effective in its leadership, organization, logistical structure, and its ideologies than all the other peaceful, nonviolent movements, mass movements.
And we have to go back to Egypt, because
Yes.
with the rise of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, there was this debate between the Brotherhood,
Yes.
which said, no, we can take power through elections,
Right.
through nonviolent means, and the so-called Salafis
Right.
in Egypt,
Right.
who actually were convinced
Yes.
by the Brotherhood. I think there were roughly 60 Salafis, I can't remember the exact number, within the parliament.
Right.
And
Yes.
then with the overthrow of Morsi,
Yes.
and the thing about Morsi, with all of the mistakes that Morsi made in terms of turning on the secular opposition, is that he worked overtime to try and placate the military.
Yes.
And in countries like Iraq or Egypt, the military is not just a military force, but an economic force.
Right.
They control whole segments of the economy,
Correct.
including military industries.
Correct.
And it failed. The military, certainly with the support of probably Washington and Israel, certainly with the support of Israel, and that sent a message not only to the Salafis or the jihadists
Right.
in Egypt,
Right.
but throughout the Middle East.
Right. But it's interesting to see that this message can take two different forms. The first one, you can say a positive form. If you look at Al-Nahda in Tunisia, who actually won the election and the presidency and so on until recently, last year. But what happens in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Nahda took a different directions. They basically rolled back and opened up much more space to the Nida Tunis, which is much more left liberal platform, who won the election and the presidency, because they realized if they pursue such a confrontational course, they might be, oppressed and annihilated. So it took a positive form. Whereas in Iraq and Syria, due to the context, a different context, we have ISIS.
Right.
So what I was saying is the first type of violence was the physical military intervention of violence. The second one is the systemic corruption, the expropriation and disposition of the majority of the people of their resources, public resources. And this is very clear in Iraq. The way the United States institutionalized the political system and all this formula of muhassasa,
Right.
power sharing formula, it actually deprived all the Iraqi people from the access to the public resources they used to have.
And I think we should just interject here by saying that before the war,
Yeah.
Iraq had a very vibrant middle class.
Exactly.
I remember visiting Iraqi hospitals, which
Yes.
I think were built by the Swedes. I mean, they were modern hospitals.
Yes.
Yes, Saddam Hussein ran an extremely repressive and horrific regime,
Correct.
but economically,
Correct.
Iraq
Yeah.
shared in the oil wealth of the country, the average Iraqi.
Correct. Part of the legitimacy of the Ba'ath Party, it was not only based on violence.
But the
and
Ba'ath Party
power.
was the ruling party, we
Exactly.
should say, in
It's
Iraq.
not only intelligence and violence.
Right.
That's true too, but I think the biggest chunk of the legitimacy of the Ba'ath Party was based on the redistribution of the oil income in forms of free public health care,
Right.
education,
Very fine
pension, and
educational
so on.
system, yeah.
So even the majority of the Shiites and the Kurds, right, who hated Saddam as in Baathists,
Right.
benefited from this redistribution of the income. Now, with the privatization of Bremer, Iraqi people called the Caliph of Baghdad in 2000.
Bremer was the American.
Exactly.
Right.
In May 2003,
Right.
the privatization and the institutionalization of the U.S. strategy of shock and awe, which is state-sponsored terror on the one hand, and cash, corruption, using money to buy and co-opt some forces in Iraq. It was institutionalized.
Right.
So the outcome of this, you have one of the most corrupt states on the face of this earth. So the majority of the people in the Middle East, the absolute majority, up to 65%, are under 24. In Iraq, 45% of the young people are under 14, so it's the youngest population probably on a worldwide scale. Now, what do they see? They see at the top of the state a systemic corruption, systematic plundering of the resources of the country, and they transfer all these resources outside the country. There's no healthcare, no education, no jobs, no pension, no nothing. On the other hand, they see ISIS. Okay, they pay you $500 a month, and they share with you any resources they plunder, be it oil or gas or taxes. They distribute this among their followers. Now, if you are a young Iraqi, Syrian, Libyan, etc., you see peaceful revolution failed
Right.
because there was an immense, external and internal intervention in a violent way. The state is corrupt, but then there's a much effective.
Right, it's not only
organization.
corrupt, but
Yeah.
it's also sectarian in
Sectarian,
the sense that
exactly.
it feeds a Shiite elite at
Exactly.
the expense of the Sunni majority.
Exactly, and sectarian in the sense, not in a religious sense, but in a class sense. So you have the majority of the people, the young people in Iraq, have no jobs, no education, no health care, no perspective whatsoever. They are arrested, incarcerated for no reasons. There were so many protests the last few years for basic services, for electricity,
And we should say
water.
non-violent mass protests.
Non-violent, and
Yeah.
they were faced by these militias of different parties in power, and a lot of people were massacred in
Right.
Basra, in Baghdad,
That's
etc.
right.
So, and then on the other hand, they see an effective form of organization like ISIS. They can earn money, they can share the resources, and they can push back against this class-based sectarian politics within the country. So you have these young people looking at ISIS.
Right.
They earn $500 a month,
These are the fighters.
the fighters, and if they occupy a territory, if there's oil, gas, whatever resources they take, they redistribute the resources among their followers, and they collect taxes,
And they're very good against corruption.
and they're good against corruption, and they bring services, basic service to the people.
Right.
In Mosul now you have electricity, but not Baghdad and Basra.
Right.
Why is this the case? Because most of at least the leadership of ISIS, most of them used to be Iraqi bureaucrats and officers and generals. People have enormous institutional experience. They know how to run things compared to the current corrupt political class in Iraq. So they know how to deal with this everyday life. They know how to bring services to the people. So these are the options the young people have. One, a corrupt political system. On the other hand, an effective, violent, but much more socially and ideologically appealing organization than the current
And there's
political
two
system.
important points about ISIS.
Yes.
The first is that much of the territory that ISIS controlled
yeah.
was in chaos.
Yeah.
And people forget that there were, competing warlords and, people were being kidnapped for money.
Right.
And so civil society completely broken down,
Yes.
courtesy of the American occupation.
Yes.
And for whatever terror ISIS carries out, and it certainly does carry out horrific terror, it has brought, as you point out, a semblance of, if not normalcy, at least order.
Right.
That's the first attraction.
Right.
The second is that, as you have also pointed out, the deep disappointment, especially among the young, in the failure of the Arab Spring, the failure of these nonviolent movements, has made them ask the question, which is a question that people in the Middle East have been asking since the end of World War I.
Yes.
How are we going to build an authentic liberation movement? This is what was the impetus of Nasser in Egypt, and of course the Baathists, who are really just a mirror in essence of the Nasserites. And these secular regimes soon became corrupted, and not only became corrupted, but eventually became tools of imperial power once again. Hosni Mubarak being a kind of classic example of that. And so the ability of ISIS to bring order and to actually function as a liberation movement. You see that when they tear down the border post between Syria and Iraq, they will write, this is the end of Sykes-Picot, the 1916 agreement that the imperial powers used to redraw the map of the Middle East, and that is true.
Correct. And two things. The first one is, I don't think I think it's very simplistic to demonize one force and forget about the others. So ISIS, yes, is a terrorist organization, but so too the Iraqi state is, with its militias. So too the U.S.
And let's not leave out, that's a very important point, because remember when they captured the Jordanian pilot, and they burned the Jordanian pilot in a cage, which was barbaric and horrible. But why? Because American planes were incinerating whole families inside their houses.
Right.
And so what they did was a cruder
Yeah.
version,
Yes.
but morally it was the same.
Yeah.
And that's what we on the outside don't see.
Right, like for instance, think about Yemen, since years,
Yes.
they're using drone, massacring families and so on. So we don't see this state terror, state-sponsored terror. We see only the so-called private or civil terror.
Right.
And I want to avoid this simplistic worldview. And that's why I was arguing years ago in understanding Iraq that terror is a form of governance ever since the US occupied Iraq. So ISIS represent and embodied this form of governance. The second point, and I think this is very important, what enabled ISIS to become as such as Islamic Caliphate is the peaceful protests in Ramadi, in Fallujah, in the western provinces of Iraq in 2013 for
Against corrupt
against
government.
corruption, against exclusion.
Right.
Chris, as you know, social exclusion is not only violent; it produces more violence. So people protested for 1 year peacefully. They were camping, occupying the space just like occupied. So what the Minister President at that time, al-Maliki, did, he used for the first time probably in the history of Iraq, used the army against the civilian and massacred many of them in Ramadi, in Fallujah, and in Mosul. There were also other peaceful protests. At this stage, in December 2013, where you have fighters of Islamic State entering the western provinces of Iraq, and then within a few months they occupied Mosul after that. So it's very important to remember the western and northwestern provinces of Iraq, which I don't call the Sunni provinces, a nomadic formation. I come from a nomadic family. My father was a nomad. So historically, they are the one who actually secure the border of Iraq. Any government, was it the monarchy or the Republican under Qasim or the Ba'athists, they rely on the nomads to control the western, northwestern territories and borders of Iraq.
It's also true in Egypt, by the way.
They are, they know the territory perfectly. So, but when al-Maliki attacked these peaceful protesters, all the tribes there, they did not resist the Islamic State fighter. They just let them in. Not that they support them, but they enabled them by not resisting them. Because Iraq, as you know, historically speaking, doesn't have this form of extremism, especially in Islamic sense. It's mostly liberal understanding of Islam. So what enabled ISIS to become as such today was the failure of the Iraqi government and of the US government by betting on al-Maliki all the time and until we have these disasters.
Right.
And I think this is very important to understand. This is just didn't fall like manna from heaven.
Right.
It has a real material
and
context.
we should also be clear that the U.S. came in, they brought in Colonel James Steele, who was running the mill group in El Salvador when I was covering the war,
Absolutely.
to
The Salvador
arm,
options,
train,
yes.
and empower Shiite death squads.
Absolutely. Militias and so on. Absolutely.
Death squads.
Yes. Yes.
Out of the Ministry of Interior.
Yes, absolutely. By the way, ممكن أدخن؟
اتفضل.
شكرا. تشرب سيجارة؟
نعم أنا ما بشرب شكرا.
عفوا.
Let's talk about the occupation.
Right.
I mean, I would argue that from the point of American history, it is probably the most disastrous strategic decision
Correct.
America has ever made.
Correct. Correct.
And it has, of course, destroyed Iraq as a unified country, which
Yes.
I don't think it's going to come back as a unified country.
Yeah.
It has upset the balance of power between Iran and Iraq.
Yes.
And it has spawned extremist jihadism, which, as you correctly point out, is a reflection of the state terrorism and violence. 1 million Iraqis were responsible for the death of 1 million Iraqis, 3 to 4 million refugees.
Correct.
The physical destruction of Iraq, as we spoke about before, it
Yes.
had an advanced infrastructure, a thriving middle class, a well-educated population. All of that we wiped out.
Correct.
What are the consequences now within Iraq and the Middle East
Yes.
of what we as Americans have done?
I think an important issue here is the civil war in Syria and the militarization of the revolution in Syria. It started, as you know, peacefully. But then you have the regional power, but international power, supporting different factions in Syria against al-Assad. And the weird thing about it, it's sometimes, I argued once on the Real News that when the war of terror become endemic, justification are contingent. So you have the same regional international power supporting one force in Syria and fighting it in Iraq, and vice versa. And that's what complicated things. So I think if the conflict in Syria is not resolved peacefully and politically, and if the constellation of forces in Iraq are not shifted in a radical sense, that the majority of the people feel included politically, economically, territorially, there is no way you can deal with the Islamic State or other jihadist group for that matter. The good news is I was following the latest wave of protests in Iraq and Lebanon, Beirut. Mostly young people,
Right.
They don't belong to any parties, grassroots organization start protesting since weeks against lack of services, electricities and water and clean water, etc. But now they realize once you start protesting against these basic services and you are confronted with the state power, things are transformed. Now people are asking for a regime change because they realize basic services are organically linked to the constellation of forces that control the state apparatus and institutions. So there's no way you can get electricity where you have 50 degrees centigrade if you have corrupt political system.
Right.
So all of a sudden you have all these young people across the country, and the good news is, especially in the so-called Shiite provinces of Iraq, the majority of the young Shiite populations, they are joining other Iraqis, be them Sunni or Kurds or Muslims, regardless, because they realize all of them, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, are faced with the same
Right.
problems.
Let me
And I
just-
think that's a good news.
There's one difference between the Israeli state and the Islamic,
Islamic State, yes.
And that is that the Israeli state
Yes.
was able to survive because of primarily American but outside military and financial support.
Yes.
The Islamic State does not have that.
That, and the other thing, the context. Israel was created in a bipolar world order.
Right.
And for both at that time, for the US and for Stalin, Stalin thought, it's a socialist state against all these, primitive Arabs, etc. And the US, of course, supported Israel against the influence of the Soviet Union, etc. So the world historical context of Israel is not there. We are in the mid of a world disorder,
Right.
or what I have termed a war order. War became endemic, and I think that's the only way for the ruling classes in Europe, the United States, and regionally to process the crisis.
I would just close by saying,
Yeah.
which most people don't know,
Yeah.
is that the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 justified the militarists throughout the Arab world.
Correct.
So that in countries like
Correct.
Syria, for
Yes,
instance,
yes.
or Lebanon,
Yeah.
we had strong democratic
Yeah.
movements.
Yes.
But with the rise of Israel
Yeah.
as an adjutant
Right.
within the Middle East,
Right.
it transformed the Middle East
Yes.
into
A
this
militarist,
antagonistic war of parties.
Yes.
And that is what destroyed democracy
Yeah.
and the nascent, and in some cases strong, in
Yes.
the case of Lebanon,
Yeah.
democratic forces
Right.
that were the most hopeful signs within the Middle East.
Yes. And as I said, I'm pretty happy about what I observed the last few weeks, what's going on, again in the Middle East. Peaceful, nonviolent protests, grassroots protests, beyond the sectarian,
Right.
religious, whatever, artificial construction of the body politics. And that's something which gives me a lot of hopes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And they put me in a shack. Stole my name. Left me in chains.